Hello, biology. Welcome to chapter 21. You'll notice that we've been skipping chapters around a lot lately, and that's because we're just picking and choosing the ones that are the most relevant for biology class instead of like a specific animal type classes. So we're going to go over chapter 21 and 25, and those are the last two chapters we're going to have this year. And it looks like your final is going to be over both of those chapters, kind of one test combined. And the chapter 21 is going to be what's a plant. Chapter 25 is what's an animal. So we're just going to go over general characteristics of both of those. I know you probably already know much of the characteristics of both of them, but we're going to go to details and vocabulary and stuff like that. So we have that to look forward to. But for today, we're just going to talk about plants. What is a plant? If you look here, you probably, I mean, if I told you to identify a plant in this picture, hopefully you guys could say, well, there's that kind of flower, there's that kind of flower, there's whatever this is, there's whatever that is. There are those trees. There's probably, that looks like something even different. I would assume you guys know, in general, 90% of the times you could identify a plant out there. There might be an occasional thing to where you're like, well, is a mushroom a plant? No, it's not, but I can understand why you might think that. So in this chapter, we're going to learn specifically what's a plant. So a plant is a multicellular eukaryote. If we stop there, that means you are also technically a plant because you are also a multicellular eukaryote. But that's not the full definition. Most plants can produce their own food in the form of glucose through the process of photosynthesis. In addition, plant cells have thick cell walls made of cellulose, and the stems and leaves of most plants have a waxy, waterproof coating called the cuticle. I do not believe any of you can do all of that part, and if you can, please let me know because you are the next generation of humans, and you could probably make a lot of money. But plants make their own food through photosynthesis. We learned the process of photosynthesis quite a while ago. That's like a plant thing. There are other things that do that. We know bacteria can do it. We know some algae can do it. But that's mostly what the plants do. The cell walls, we know some bacteria have that as well, but that's what plants have most of the time. They have that cell wall. They have stems, they have leaves, they have this covering, the cuticle. So if we add all this stuff together, then we pretty much get that is a plant. So other things might have one or two of these characteristics, but none of them have all of these characteristics together. Once we bundle all these characteristics together, that's what we consider a plant. If the world is 4 billion years old, then according to the geologic evidence, about 1 billion years ago, there were no plants, but they evolved shortly after that. They think that the only thing that might have been there is a bunch of bacteria and algae that's kind of chilling in the water, along with like sea sponges and jellyfish and stuff like that. And they believe that eventually some algae kind of washed up on shore, and it didn't really mind not being in the water. So eventually it kind of just got used to being out of the water. And after generations and generations, they believe that some of the algae adapted to actually living a little better on land than in the water. And from there, we get all of the plants we've ever had. The reason why scientists think that is because both algae and plants have the same type of chlorophyll used in photosynthesis. They all have cell walls that contain cellulose, both algae and plants. And they also store food in the form of starch, which algae and plants are the only thing that do that. All the other groups of organisms store energy in the form of glycogen, sugars, and lipids. Different kinds of sugars than starch and lipids. So that's why they think algae probably were first, and then plants came after that because they share a lot of similar characteristics that no other classes of organisms share. We have some fossil evidence to say that maybe 440 million years ago, the plants started forming up. They probably didn't have leaves yet. They did not get that adaptation, according to this timeline. But plants do have a lot of adaptations today. So over time, plants have gained these adaptations. What is it? According to the theory of evolution, over the past 443 million years, plants have developed a bunch of these adaptations. Remember, an adaptation is just like something that has been developed in order to ensure survival, or at least increase the odds of survival. So for algae, they're surrounded in water because they live in water, right? So plants need water, algae need water, so algae are kind of fine. The argument is algae needed to find ways to survive outside of water. Because if they spent all their time in water, obviously land is not in water. Those are two different things. So there was some adaptation that needed to come about, or some design choices that needed to come about for these plants. And the first thing is if plants need water, then it's important not to lose that water once they got it. So one of the adaptations plants have, or one of the characteristics that plants have, is that they all have this smooth, slightly slippery coating on them. If you ever get an apple and you scratch it with your nails just a little bit, you probably can feel what I'm talking about here. It's we already mentioned that, but it's called a cuticle. And what that does is those things, that material doesn't dissolve in water. So it covers the plant so that no extra water will leave the plant without its permission, if that makes sense. It's a little barrier that says, hey, water, sorry, you can't actually pass through here. You have to stay inside the leaf. And that helps the plant keep the water once it gets the water. I hope that makes sense. The plant needs water, so one thing that's important is to not lose it, and the way it doesn't lose it is by covering itself in this wax, because the water cannot go through this wax. Another adaptation is photosynthesis. I bet you never thought the word leaf would be a bold word in your vocabulary list, but it is. The leaf is a plant organ that grows from a stem and is usually where photosynthesis occurs. They vary greatly in size and shape, and they can vary greatly even on the same plant. So you can imagine if the whole plant is trying to get a bunch of sunlight, it might be beneficial to have a bunch of flat areas pointing towards the sun, right? So that's kind of what leaves are for. I don't want to say they're like solar panels because it's really the opposite. Solar panels are kind of like leaves. The solar panels are flat things to try to catch as much sunlight, and leaves are also like flat things trying to catch as much sunlight as they can so the plant can get as much food as they can. Another characteristic of plant is the fact that they have roots. I know some of this stuff seems incredibly obvious, like why is leaf and root a vocabulary word? Well, because we're trying to make sure we know the definition of a plant. What makes a plant a plant? Well, the leaves do. The fact that it doesn't lose water because of that cuticle, that makes it a plant. The fact that it has roots makes it a plant. Because not all organisms that you might think are plants have roots, and that's one of the ways we can tell the difference, like fungus and stuff like that. So you guys know roots are how plants get their nutrients and their water from the soil. You also probably know that the roots help keep the plant in the ground. And in some cases, such as potatoes or radishes or onions, actually I'm not sure about onions. I'm gonna take that back about onions, but potatoes and radishes at least, those guys are how the plant stores food. So it stores some of the energy in those roots. And that's one of the purposes of roots. And then obviously they taste really good, so we eat them. But a potato is just a root ball, essentially, for the plant to store a bunch of energy. Now, that's not why they were made like that. I mean, the plant is doing that so it has enough energy to live long, but we just happen to come around and eat it instead of the plant eating it. So one of the uses for root is food storage, and then the other one's, like we just said, absorbing water and absorbing soil. Something else that plants do that might be, this one might not be as obvious. Water moves from the roots of trees to the leaves. And the sugars produced in the leaves move from the roots through the stem. Move to the roots from the stem, I'm sorry, I said that backwards. So water goes from roots up and sugar goes from leaves down, which means there has to be some way of transporting all of this material. We see that the stem is an organ. I know you might not think of it as an organ, but it's considered an organ that provides support for growth, and it contains tissues for transporting food, water, and other materials from one part of the plant to another. So we have like our bloodstream, right? If you eat food, the food gets digested and that gets in your bloodstream and the blood takes it everywhere your body needs to. The stem is essentially what's responsible for doing that for plants. There are some cases where you see here the stems can undergo photosynthesis as well, but the primary site is usually the leaves because those are large flat green areas. The way though, the way that plants move stuff through the stem is through what we call vascular tissues. And that's tube-like elongated cells through which food, water, and other materials can be transported. Not all plants have vascular tissues though. We see here, plants that possess vascular tissues are known as vascular plants, which the fact that it's telling you that means there's probably non-vascular plants, and we will go over those a little bit. Most of the plants you are familiar with are vascular plants. So we see ivy, trees, ferns, sunflowers. All those are vascular plants, which means they have these little tubes inside of them to help transport water and sugar throughout the whole thing. There are non-vascular plants, and this is like moss and liverworts and hornworts. I'll show you pictures of those later. But moss is probably the easiest way to think about it. Those do not have those tubes to transport nutrients. So what happens is instead of using those nutrients, what they have to do is just go from cell to cell. So by the process of diffusion and osmosis, that's the only way they can transport stuff across their bodies. We talked about that in a previous chapter and saying that's not a very efficient way of transporting materials throughout a large organism. And that is correct. That's why most of those plants you see here usually no more than a few cells thick. And they are usually short on purpose because they don't have vascular tissue to be able to grow large. They have to stay small scale in order for that diffusion and that osmosis to work. And oh boy, the reproductive strategies of plants, it's complicated. It's even complicated trying to smush it down for you, but I think the book does a job. I'm going to try to improve it just a little bit. So not all plants, but adaptations in some land plants include seeds. A seed is a plant organ that contains an embryo along with the food supply and is covered by a protective coat. We see that here. See the embryo, seed coat, and the food supply. Sorry. In non-seed plants, however, which includes those things like mosses we were just talking about, and ferns, which you might be familiar with, the sperm require a film of water on the gametophyte plant to reach the egg. In seed plants, which include all conifers and flowering plants, sperm will reach the egg without the use of film of water. And this difference is why a lot of these non-vascular plants usually hang out in watery, wet areas because they need that water to not only to reproduce, but they need, not only because all plants need water, but so that they can reproduce. So land plants reduce by either spores or seeds, but in most non-seed plants, they need to be kind of near water in order to reproduce. And this is where it gets complicated, this picture right here and this alternation of generations. This is something you probably have not learned. All the way up until here, you probably came across this in at least like science, maybe in 7th grade. But this alternation of generations, this is kind of new information. So, as an algae, which we did not talk about, but it's just letting you know, the lives of all plants include 2 different stages, or 2 different generations. One of them is the gametophyte generation, and the other one is the sporophyte generation. Gametophytes having n number of chromosomes, sporophytes having 2n number of chromosomes. All the cells, hold on, let me read from here. The gametophyte generation of a plant results in the development of gametes, which egg and sperm. Okay? So the gametophyte results in eggs and sperm. All cells of the gametophyte, including the gametes, are haploids, meaning they have N cells. All cells of the sporophyte have 2N chromosomes. These reproduce by mitosis. The spores are produced in the sporophyte plant, part of the plant, by meiosis and are therefore haploid. Okay, so it's still kind of complicated, but let's go through this. We got a little baby plant. It grows through mitosis and cell division, and eventually some part of it undergoes meiosis and makes some spores. And that leads us to the gametophyte generation. So this is kind of like the normal plant. Goes through meiosis and makes the spores, which can make the female gametes or the male gametes. Once these combine, you get a new baby plant. That's really simplified. In non-seed vascular plants, such as ferns, spores have an outer hard covering. Spores are released into the environment where they can grow into haploid gametophyte plants. So this is the weird part. In some plants, these two are independent organisms almost. So like you can find a gametophyte version and a sporophyte version of the plant, and they'll look different, but it's the same species. The gametophyte goes out there and grows. Once it gets fertilized, the sporophyte plant will then develop. So in this non-seed vascular plant, the spores go out and they grow as a gametophyte plant. Once they get fertilized, they become a sporophyte plant. In seed plants, such as trees or flowers, spores develop inside the sporophyte and become the gametophytes. The gametophytes become part of the sporophyte. Okay? So in that case, in like trees and flowers, the two generations are in the same plant. The flowers, some internal part of the flower is technically the gametophyte, and the plant that you see is the sporophyte. This is why it's a really strange thing to think about. I want to highlight this right here. Gametophytes and angiosperms and gymnosperms are pollen grains and ovules. So what that means is the reproductive part of the plant in large trees and flowers are attached to the sporophyte. So if we look at this picture, if we look at this picture, we see right here, this is the plant, this is the plant, this is the plant, and this is the plant. So with some plants, the gametophyte and the sporophyte are almost two separate looking plants. Here, we see them as two separate plants that look very different. As we get to larger and larger organisms, the gametophytes get smaller and smaller, and they become part of the plant. So here, these are two separate things, but here, these are inside of like the cones and the flowers here, or these are inside of the cones or flowers there. So it's really complicated, and essentially, in some cases, the gametophyte and sporophyte are two separate organisms, independent organisms. And in the larger plants, the gametophytes and the sporophytes are the same thing. It's just that the gametophytes, the part that are making the reproductive cells, are attached to the plant. I hope that makes sense. It's weird. It's very strange. I hope that makes sense. And one more time. In some plants, the gametophyte and the sporophyte grow independently. So one of the plants has two N chromosomes, the other one has N chromosomes, but they're the same species. One of them is just responsible for making reproductive cells. As you get to larger and larger plants, these two things are no longer independent plants. They are the same thing. It's just that the gametophytes, or the part that are making the reproductive cells, are attached to the sporophytes, and they cannot live separately. These cannot live separately. This one can. Really complicated stuff, but hopefully you guys got that. Go and watch the next video for section 2.